I'm Peter Ross, I'm Principal Librarian at Guildhall Library, and you find us once again in the stores, and we're in the section on London history. Because Guildhall Library is a library of London history. We have the greatest collection devoted to the history of a single city anywhere in the world, dating from the 15th century onwards. But we're in a particular area where we have something called Penny Dreadful. Penny Dreadfuls and Bloods are 19th century fictions created essentially for young men. So Bloods are the earlier ones, dating from the 1830s, 40s, 50s. They were aimed at an adult population, so they're basically racy stories that you could buy part by part. So serial publications, you'd buy a part each week and you'd follow the story. Much like Dickens published his early novels, in fact most of his novels, in serial form. So Oliver Twist, Pickwick Papers, Nicholas Nickleby, were all issued in weekly parts, and you would buy those parts and you'd have to wait till the next week for the next part of the thrilling adventure. So here we have a number of Penny Dreadfuls or Bloods. Penny Dreadfuls were aimed at young boys later in the 19th century. The phrases are sort of interchangeable, Bloods and Penny Dreadfuls. So we have a number of these. They are fictions. They may be about London legends. They're often about criminals, legendary stories about London, sometimes about buildings in London where they built a story around it, much like Ainsworth would build a whole series of stories around a particular location, like St Paul's or the Tower of London. So we have them even though they're fictions, because they're just as important in the history of London to look at the fiction to do with London as it is to do with the fact of London. So this one, for instance, here, this is called the Old House in West Street, and it refers to a building that was demolished in the middle of the 19th century. But when they were demolishing it, they found literally found skeletons in the cupboard and cellars with escape routes down into the sewers. And so a number of writers would write a fiction about what went on in this particular house. So if we look at this one quite closely, you will see that each part, as it came out week by week, would have an illustration, sometimes a full-page illustration, sometimes one dropped into text like this. But also down the bottom, you see that it has the number of the parts. So this is part number 1, and usually the parts were about 8 pages long. This is part 6, for instance, so probably about 8 pages for each one. They were very cheap. They're called Penny Dreadfuls because they were usually a penny. Some slightly posher ones you might pay a bit more. Later in the 19th century you got down to halfpenny Dreadfuls, so half the price. So you can imagine that they're not written by the most famous of authors, because they didn't need to write this sort of fiction at the time, but they were incredibly popular, and some of them ran for years and years. So you'd be reading the same story for 2 or 3 years. There's one called Black Bess about Dick Turpin that is very nearly the longest novel ever written in the English language. It goes into 242 parts, so you'd have to wait for years to get to the end of the story. And in fact, although it's about Dick Turpin, after the first 25 parts, it's moved away from the story of Dick Turpin. They're just inventing other stories to fill up the pages, clearly because it was selling. So that was called The Old House in West Street. Let's find another one. There's one down here called Charlie Wag. No, Wat Tyler, sorry. This is Wat Tyler. So this is fictionalising the history of London. And again, as you can see, it comes with an illustration. So this is number 1. This is by Pierce Egan the Younger, who's actually a more famous author than you'd usually find writing this sort of material. And this is actually better produced, so this may have been a twopenny fiction. As you can see, it's published in 2 columns, so you can get more text into each issue. And as you can see, number 2 again starts with an illustration. What's very rare about these particular publications is that each of those parts would have come with a coloured cover to it. They're called wrappers. They often don't survive. We have a few in the collection. They're exceptionally rare because people would normally rip off the wrappers when they bound them up into these big volumes. So that's some fictions, excuse me, to do with London. But that doesn't mean we don't collect modern fiction to do with London. So this is a well-known author, Edward Rutherford, who writes novels based around massive themes, and his novels can often cover huge amounts of time. So this one we've got clearly because it's a fictionalised account of London. So we still collect a small amount of fiction, but only where its theme is London. We don't collect London authors like Dickens now. We have the complete works of Dickens, but we wouldn't get each new edition of Dickens. Essentially we're buying texts. We're not buying an author for his importance, but the text is important to the history of London. So we still add to our fiction collections, but only in a very small way.